The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com's weekly sale. Head on over to StarCityGames.com/sale because now until Sunday, October 31st at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time, you can save big on all Magic the Gathering bulk lots and collections. If you are looking for a chance to buy just a ton of cards for not a lot of money, this is the sale for you. Bulk common uncommon collections? Absolutely. Bulk rare lots? Lots of them. Bulk basic lands? Definitely. Even bulk tokens? Especially ones for your Cubic Commander deck? We have those too. Everything you can imagine in bulk, Magic the Gathering, bulk lots, and collections on sale now until October 31st, 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. Go on over to StarCityGames.com/sale.
Hello there from Dominario's Judgment, a weekly podcast for Star City Games with me, Dom Harvey.
And me, Ari Lex.
Where we bring you the latest, greatest, and downright weirdest things Modern has to offer.
Want to know what to expect for next weekend's events? We've got you covered.
Do you want deep breakdowns of the hot topics and decks in Modern? We've got you covered.
Just want to make sure you don't miss the latest nonsense before your opponents teach you a lesson about it in the queues? Oh yeah, we have definitely got you covered. Find us every week on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Or if you want to head over to StarCityGames.com, we'll be right there alongside all the great content from all your other favorite content producers.
The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. Head over to coalesceapparel.shop and use gift code SCG at checkout to save 10% off your entire order. If you want to rep the coolest Magic the Gathering themed hoodies and t-shirts or stickers, head over to coalesceapparel.shop. Maybe you want to rep our fallen friend Golos with the Tireless Pilgrim versus the Multiverse shirt. Or maybe you're Wooburg Forever and you want to go with the South Beach collection. Any way you want to do it. Anti-Mulligan Mulligan Club? We got you. MTG Jam? Of course. And all of the Keeping It 100 line. There for you. CoalesceApparel.shop. Use gift code SCG at checkout for 10% off your entire order. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves. Welcome back, one and all, to the 540 as we are journeying closer and closer to Crimson Vow coming out. We've not quite reached it, so we just have a couple of more episodes until the previews start rolling. I'm Justin Parnell. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter. And of course, my patient yet kind co-host.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Overturf, and you can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. Good use of the word patient, as it's been so long since we had a set release.
Yeah, it's almost unbelievable. I haven't checked, so I don't want anybody to quote me on this. But I think this might be the longest time between two sets ever.
Yeah, very likely, and maybe even going into the future. But luckily, they have given us a little 3-week stretch of the Magic Online Vintage Cube to tide us over.
How perfect. And that is going to, I want to segue into what we're talking about today. But before I do, I want to remind everyone that the next episode of this podcast, which we are going to record exactly at this time next week, you don't know when that is, but it's this time right now, is going to be our first mailbag podcast. And you, sweet listener, have until October 31st to get in your question, be it via Twitter, be it via YouTube comment, or some other method that hopefully one of our producers will send to us. I would stick with the first two, but go wild if you want. So October 31st, mailbag podcast. You can ask us whatever cube related questions you want, and we will take our best and or favorite questions and go down and answer those on the podcast next week.
Yeah, we've gotten some good questions and a decent amount of questions, but we're definitely looking for more. So send those questions our way. Keep them coming. Even if you already asked one, ask 2, maybe 3, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, you never know. If you have obviously we will prioritize hopefully getting people's first questions. But if you have great questions, we're not going to ignore those. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. So we'll remind you at the end of the show, but this is really your last chance. By the time you hear this, after you finish listening to this podcast, if it's before the 31st or on the 31st, send us a question. We'll see if we can get it in when we record. So Ryan, you had mentioned that the Vintage Cube is back for a 3-week stint. That's quite long.
Yeah, it's a nice little stretch. I've already been going hard. I'm kind of in draft hell right now because I've done 10 drafts. I have 1 3-0 and 9 2-1s. And like that's such a good win rate. Like that's like a 70% win rate, but also just
but how does the win rate feel?
Yeah, the spread is I want to rip all the skin off my body. It's incredibly frustrating, but a lot of the games are sweet as Vintage Cube. But
of course, but not everything in the cube is sweet.
That's a good point.
Not everything in the cube is sweet, even though the experience might be, and I'm sure all those 2-1s aren't. But today we're going to be. I don't know if this is going to be a recurring segment or a recurring type of episode, or we've been thinking, we've been talking, and we have found that some cards in Cube are overrated. And today we're going to be talking about overrated cards, the Magic Online Vintage Cube Edition.
Yes, and this is neither yours nor my personal top 8 most hated or overrated from our perspective, but this is 8 cards that we both agree are very overrated based off of our experience playing Vintage Cube online and off.
Yes, very much so. Yeah. Now, all of these cards do appear in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, the one that's present before you today if you're listening in real time. But I have played with and against all of these cards multiple times in a lot of cube settings, including vintage cubes and powered cubes. So we put together this top 8 list, as Ryan said, and I think I'm ready to get into it. Just dive right in.
Let's do it.
All right. So number 8 in our top 8 overrated cards, Magic Online Vintage Cube Edition, coming in at number 8, Mana Flare. Ryan, why is Mana Flare overrated?
So it's the sort of thing, and this is going to be the case for not all of the cards on our list, but many of them, where playing this card at face value is really not what you want to be doing. So it's an enchantment for 2 and a red, and it makes it so whenever a land is tapped for mana, it produces double that type and amount. And the idea behind this card, where you might be successful with it in a format like Vintage Cube, is usually some kind of combo deck. Ideally, you can win that turn, or in a more unconventional way, maybe you can stop your opponent from winning and set up for the following turn. But it is really precarious to just give your opponent free reign with a Mana Flare. You want to be doing something like Frantic Search, and then parlaying immediately in the time spiral and just keep untapping your lands and making more mana, and then casting some giant Eldrazi or going into some big storm turn. But you really want to win that turn. That's the most important thing, because when you pass a turn with Mana Flare, your opponent's got some big stuff that they didn't have the mana to cast. There are so many bad things that can happen. And one of the most basic ones is your opponent plays 4 mana card, also disenchant your Mana Flare. And for most cards, trading 1 for 1 is not that bad, but giving your opponent a free Dark Ritual and then trading for 1 is incredibly bad. You lose the game on the spot. And that's a big thing that happens with Mana Flare, is just you try, and when you fail, is just even a very small 1 for 1 exchange just leaves you cold.
Yes. This card is in a group of cards, and there are other cards on this list, as we will get to, that fit into this category, where they are primarily constructed cards. Now, that doesn't mean you can't play them in a limited format. But what I say with constructed card is this card is generally designed to be played in an environment where you can play, more than one copy of a card. Because as you're trying to go through and operate your deck with having access to double the amount of mana, you need to be able to execute a plan, such as one that Ryan was pulling off. However, you have one of every card. And I understand that you have access to all the most powerful cards in Magic, and you have some agency over whether you were able to get them. But oftentimes, you don't have as much agency over to be able to sculpt them into your hand for this magical Christmas land turn as you generally think that you can. Now, Mana Flare, again, like a lot of other cards on this list, is a terrible, terrible card to pass to your opponent to give access to. Because a lot of Magic cards are really, really good at half the cost that they should. And that's really how I kind of look at Mana Flare. And the thing is, even if your opponent doesn't have Time Spirals and Frantic Searches and Eldrazi's and Mind's Desires and stuff like that in their deck. Well, as it turns out, they weren't drafting like Planar Chaos Limited. They were also drafting Vintage Cube, and they're going to have all of the other best cards in Magic that you don't have. So as it turns out, you're just giving them the ability to execute whatever their game plan is at twice the speed. And the difference is, you had to put that Mana Flare into your deck, and you had to cast it, and you had to do whatever hoops, mental or physical hoops, you had to jump through to put that Mana Flare in your deck to try to pull off this. And they simply just got to reap the rewards and instead get to speed up, double speed, whatever their game plan is, to be able to beat you. And hopefully, in an absolute best case scenario, they simply just play all of their cards at half the cost rather than get rid of your Mana Flare and maybe pass the turn back. However, that's a lot to ask for because they don't have to kill it, but they can do something where you are either greatly impeded by what they're able to do, or in the worst case, they completely get rid of it. And then you have just given your opponent probably more than one Dark Ritual.
Yeah.
And you're down a card.
Yeah, you got to spend the Dark Ritual from your hand. They put the mana in their pool.
Yeah,
not a good exchange.
Yeah, and that's probably like a best case scenario if you pass the turn. That's like an absolute best case scenario. Worst case scenario is you get so far behind you can't possibly win if your opponent starts casting like multiple Planeswalkers or discard spells or cards that affect like the battlefield in a significant way. So, like, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I don't want to lie. I actually don't think I've ever seen Mana Flare. I don't think I've ever seen anyone win when they pass the turn with Mana Flare. I legitimately mean that. I
did recently lose a game to that because I was fully off of a color. Like, I mulliganed and then I was fully off of a color. And so they just got to do their thing. But that also realistically would have happened without a Mana Flare. So it's hard to give full credit there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm saying it can happen. And look, is it possible for you to play it and then just start to do your thing in the same turn? Yeah. But it requires you to have basically 3 additional mana. Then your opponent even gets started.
The big point I want to make about Mana Flare is like, just playing the card as printed for its mana cost is a trick. You just shouldn't really ever do that if you can avoid it. And putting in the card in your deck does incentivize that sometime. But more than anything, even when it is correct, you should always try to wield that Mana Flare when you want it, because nobody else should.
Yeah. Yeah, let someone else make the mistake if they're in a situation where they drafted in the first 8 picks.
Yeah.
Because if that's the case, then you have likely taken a better or more efficient or more multi-archetype viable card than they have, because Mana Flare is incredibly narrow and in a lot of cases is not even going to operate in a deck that is its base mana color.
Yes, yeah, you get to find a way to splash for it.
Yeah, you get to find a way to cast it. You're not like in your blue-black deck, and you have to also cast Mana Flare. So Mana Flare is not the most, in my opinion, not the most egregious card on this list, but one that I consider highly overrated. And to its credit, and this is probably the nicest thing I will say about it, it will always create a very memorable cube moment. But I think it creates it more often for your opponent than the person casting it.
Yeah. Yeah, you see what's going to happen pretty quickly with that one.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on Mana Flare?
Yeah, that's what I got on Mana Flare. This one kind of like barely made it onto the list. And I think it's because it is overrated in the sense that it makes some decks, but it does usually go later than I think all the other cards that we're going to discuss today. So people have kind of figured it out, but it's worth discussing as a card that's kind of dubious on the cube list.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of the cards on our list today are going to be kind of inverse of their like power level. Like Mana Flare is, it's powerful. People, a lot of people understand what we've said, and this is not the first time they've thought about that or heard that. So as we go along in the list, will be the cards that people are like, wait a second, I really like that card.
So we got some surprise ones coming up, I'm sure.
So number 7, I don't know if this is going to be a surprise or not, but it's a card that I can say pretty confidently that people like more than Mana Flare. Coming in at number 7 on our most overrated cards, Magic Online Vintage Cube Edition. I lied, it's 2 cards. It's Eureka and Show and Tell. Ryan, tell me why these 2 cards are overrated.
So these cards are actually really similar to Mana Flare in what they do. So they're 2 sorceries. Show and Tell lets both players put 1 permanent from your hand on the battlefield. Doesn't let you do Planeswalker. It's kind of a weird old templating thing. But then Eureka just lets you do any permanent, but it's also any number. So you got a 3 mana blue sorcery and a 4 mana green sorcery, and it just lets your opponent, the idea is hopefully you're putting something really good out, but it also lets your opponent immediately put something really big out as well. And you're also passing the turn. So very similar to Mana Flare, even though they're entering the battlefield at the same time, your opponent gets the first turn to go with them. And there's just so many things that can really go wrong. I talked last week a bit about how my relationship with Show and Tell ended when I ran afoul of a Cloud Goat Ranger. Yeah. And that's just like a 5 mana creature. There's much larger stuff. Your opponent can put in a Gristlebrand, a Sheoldred, an Eldrazi Titan. They could untap and cast Treachery. What's the blue? Fractured Identity. Just like a lot of ways that can immediately clean up. Or they Show and Tell Venser or Palace Jailer in, just some way to either return the thing you put in or cleanly answer it and give them some upside at the cost of no mana, no extra cards on their end. Remember, you're spending mana at sorcery speed and using a card for all these ways that these cards can backfire. And I do think that people generally know to avoid these cards, but they still show up sometimes. And sometimes I am getting late into a draft where I'm scrounging for playables and I think, maybe I have to play this Show and Tell in my Reanimator deck. And God, you really want to avoid those situations.
That's exactly what I was going to say, is I think people at the start of most drafts have the intention of course, I'm not going to do that. But then they get like the allure of Magical Christmas Land like catches them and they're like, wait a second, I've drafted 1 creature that's 8 or more mana. This Show and Tell is exactly for me. It was designed for me. It was put in this cube just for me to cast this. This card, both of these cards rather, have a problem similar to Mana Flare that Ryan outlined, is that your opponent, and in this case, almost 100% of the time is going to have access to whatever they're doing sooner than you. Because unless you're putting a haste creature in, it doesn't matter if you pass the turn to your opponent. You don't even have the ability to do the thing. Now with Eureka, you could put in Planeswalkers. That's great. These are scary cards because unlike Mana Flare doesn't say cast me as soon as possible, right? You want to build something up with Mana Flare. Eureka and Show and Tell, they want you to cast these as soon as possible because, in theory, you have built your deck in a way that you have all these gigantic, expensive things to put on the battlefield. And what do you want to do with gigantic, expensive things in your hand is you want them to be in play as quickly as possible. But the problem is that while Eureka does let you put in Planeswalkers, where Show and Tell doesn't, it also lets you put in multiple things. Now, in a lot of cases, your deck is probably going to be pretty bad if you have a Eureka or Eureka and Show and Tell, or either one or both of these, and then the rest of your deck is filled with like gigantic, expensive things. Because then you're just gonna lose before you can do the thing you want to do. And then in a case that you actually have them, what is your best case scenario? You're putting in like 1 or 2 creatures. What if your opponent just drops their entire hand when you cast Eureka? Which is very, very possible, by the way.
Mm-hmm. And just like a lot of the permanents that people play do just answer things on the battlefield.
In Cube, such a huge percentage of creatures have enter the battlefield abilities.
Mm-hmm.
Just a massive percentage. And they all do something. They all interact with something. And a lot of times it's going to be your cards. These cards, again, I think that people trick themselves into believing that these are good cards. And I actually think that of all of the cards we have on this list, these cards win the game the least amount of the time.
They actually have like a high conversion rate of resolving them and losing the game. And it's not like you cast the card and you lost. You lost because you cast the card.
Yes.
These the tie in 7 and the number 8 card, like these are the cards where you lose because you cast them.
Yeah. Had you done nothing, you would have been better off.
Right.
And again, like Mana Flare, not only does your opponent get to do the thing too, you had to put the card in your deck, spend a draft slot, and spend a deck slot and the mana to cast this card. Look, this isn't, you know, I love a little cheeky show and, you know, sneak and show deck, or like a show and tell on the sideboard of a Reanimator deck and like Legacy. That's great. Like Mana Flare, those are constructed cards where you can actually construct a deck around it with 4 ofs. This is not the case. Mm-hmm. It is incredibly hard to pull this off. You could build a deck around these cards and you still have at max 2 of these in your deck. And maybe you're able to supplement it with like, you know, a Sneak and Show or Through the Breach, which are cards that, spoiler alert, are not on this list because they have far greater applications than these do.
There's
mainly
a correlation between resolving them and winning.
Because, you know, you do the thing. Not both you and your opponent do the thing and they get to, you know, benefit from theirs first. Mm-hmm. But you know, there's just it's really easy because, you know, you formulate this best case scenario in your head, and the reality of that is you're gonna take a lot of lumps before you finally get to do your thing and win the game in a grand fashion with one of these 2 cards. Yeah.
It can only happen so many times that you show and tell and your opponent puts in the bigger thing and you say, well, I got unlucky. You know, maybe there was something we could have done.
Yeah, I would say it's probably around 3 rounds that could happen. Which is the
one full draft.
Yeah, one full draft. And, you know, maybe you go back to the well and you're like, well, that was just an incredible amount of unluckiness. Surely it won't happen again. And that's fine. You keep feeding the machine. That's how, you know, honestly, the more that someone does that, the more likely Vintage Cube is to come back to Magic Online.
That's true. Yeah, you got to keep buying those tickets.
Exactly. So, yeah, we appreciate your sacrifice, I guess. Ryan, do you have any other thoughts on Eureka and or Show and Tell?
I have no thoughts on Eureka. I do have one card that I like Show and Telling in, but it's very much in the don't try this at home camp of things. I like to show and tell in 1,000 Year Storm.
Okay, that was going to be similar to mine.
Yeah. Oh, you got a different one?
Yeah, an Omniscience.
Okay, yeah. Cards that like allow you to keep going and try to win that turn or do something insurmountable. Yeah, very similar to what we said about Mana Flare.
Yep. I think 1,000 Year Storm is another good example. Yeah, we're on the same page, I think.
Yeah.
With that type of thing. Yeah. Something that, you know, spells have haste. Creatures generally don't. So when you're able to just cast more spells.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that, like, Justin's not saying put Urabrask the Hidden or Xenagos, Ghost God of Revels in your cube and try to make it all happen, because you don't always draw all those cards. Yeah. He's saying don't try.
When I'm saying spells have haste, I mean like they do the thing immediately. They don't just like sit around. So when you put something into play that helps those, do that. Don't try to give your creatures haste to make up for it. Yeah, right. Don't do that. The good ones already have haste.
Yes.
The good haste ones have haste anyway. All right. We are going to take a short break. We got to pay some bills. So we have 6 all the way down to 1 coming up. in just one moment. Look, we're all Magic players here, so I know you're probably like me, and you have some extra cards that are hanging around that you would love to sell for cash or maybe trade in for some more cards. Well, if you're looking to sell or trade your Magic the Gathering cards, it has literally never been easier. Visit StarCityGames.com/sell with a 30% store credit trade-in bonus and the fastest turnaround time in the industry. There is no reason to sell to anybody else. We have 4 convenient ways to sell your cards to us. 1, check out our buy list. You can find out exactly what we're paying for each of your cards individually right now. That too much work? Number 2, check out our ship and sell program. Put your cards in a box, tape it up, send it to us. We'll do the rest of the work. Or if you're passing through Roanoke, Virginia, come visit Star City Comics and Games, and we can sit down with a buyer and work out a trade right there in the store. Or if you might be a store and you're looking to offload bulk and you have over 500,000 cards you're looking to sell, we can come to you. Any of the ways that you want to work with us, go to StarCityGames.com/sell. That's SELL right now for more information. All right, Ryan, we're back with number 6 on our list. Number 6 most overrated card in Magic Online Vintage Cube, Bazaar of Baghdad. Ryan, why is this card so overrated?
Powerhouse from Arabian Nights, a land that does not tap for mana, unlike Library of Alexandria. If it did, we would not be having this conversation, but it does not tap for mana. But you can tap it to draw 2 cards, then discard 3 cards. Really nice if you got a lot of free stuff and a lot of dredge going. Really tough to keep up in Vintage Cube when you're not developing your mana. I mean, the power 6 cards in the power 9 are mana sources, right? Like 6 of the 9 most powerful cards in the history of the game just tap for mana or give you a big mana boost. So it should be a red flag that you have a land that doesn't tap for mana. And then activating it is, of course, card disadvantage, draw 2, discard 3. And the idea is that this is a discard outlet. It facilitates you setting up a reanimator deck. And where it most commonly shows up, people try to draft mono black reanimator, but it's just not that hard to get blue cards into your reanimator deck. Like, the casting costs are not that restrictive. Even if you have to play a 9/8 mana base, that's totally fine. And your cards are so powerful, and your reanimator deck already has to mulligan to find your action anyway. And the big thing about getting into blue cantrips, or even just not playing Bazaar, like maybe you're heavier black and you just cast stuff like Night's Whisper, and you have all these tutors, or hopefully you're trying to get cards like Vampiric Tutor or Demonic Tutor and Tomb, and all this stuff that's a sure thing. But when you're not doing the sure thing, you really want cards that play a good game of Magic. That's why I called out Night's Whisper. Yes. It's good to draw 2 cards and then continue to have 2 cards. It's like pretty bad to draw 2 cards and immediately discard 3 when you're looking for something. Maybe you don't find it. You don't just get to keep doing that. You're not going to be given that kind of time. So this card, like, in a number of drafts, it does end up going very late. But I do see people really jump on this when they see it early in a draft. And I would just caution against that, because it really just only goes in Reanimator. And I would put it on the bench in the best versions of that deck.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. And you actually touched on a really good point. This is kind of my main point. So what type of deck have you, like, what other cards have you drafted where you were just willing to discard 3 cards? Like, you've drafted the cube with all of the good cards in it, just like everyone else has. So either you have drafted a deck that is like 20 silver bullet cards that are all situational, and you're just trying to dig to those cards, in which case your deck entirely resolves around the existence of being able to go through it very quickly with Bazaar. And it's probably not going to be very good even then, because you just have 20 situational cards. Or 2, you are trying to move cards into your graveyard incredibly fast, but at the cost of, even though you can do it repeatedly, at card disadvantage. I don't think it is difficult in the Vintage Cube to put cards into your graveyard. Actually, I think it's wildly easy. And all of the other cards that do it have a greater utility than Bazaar of Baghdad. The only thing Bazaar has over them is it doesn't cost you any mana. And I'm putting air quotes around that because, as Ryan pointed out, it costs you a land drop. And then when you don't want to do it, if you don't want to do it for a turn, it has cost you the ability to play a land and advance your mana base. You don't get that unless you are pairing this with Urborg, which I don't even know if Urborg is in the cube. I would guess not.
I'm assuming, no, I'm pretty sure it's not. Let me double check that. Yeah, it's not.
Either way, like that's not a. I'm not saying like if you have Urborg, then all sins are forgiven.
Right. Yeah, that was again not you telling people to put Urborg and Yavimaya into their cube so that their Bazaars are better.
Correct. But you have to the amount of like situational magic that you have to play with Bazaar is not consistent with how those decks generally work. Like, if you are in a game where you can play Bazaar on turn 1, then something, and then cast Reanimate on turn 2, that is like your best case scenario. But if you're having to do that over like multiple turns, you are churning through a massive amount of your deck of presumably acceptable cards to be casting in a cube match, because that's probably what you filled the rest of your deck with, that you were simply just going through trying to search for whatever Reanimator piece that you believe is worth sacrificing the rest of your deck for.
Mm-hmm.
And that is in the best case scenario where you're actually playing something that cares about the graveyard. If you're not, and you're just playing this because you're like, I just want to filter my cards, I don't think that your card quality, if that is the case, is probably going to be high enough to win regardless. And I guess if you're in that scenario, you're probably fucked anyway. If you have to rely on Bazaar to be the tie that binds your deck together, but
that would be a rough go of things. Yeah, I'm kind of talking about this card assuming you're putting in a Reanimator deck, and like I don't really want to give credence to the idea of putting it in any other deck.
I mean, I'm sure that there are people, I'm sure that it has happened, that people just put it in random decks. I think that having a land that does not produce mana is more dangerous to exist in your deck than it ever has been before, to the point that, and this is going to be a controversial statement, Ryan and I, this was one of our first disagreements, that I think that a card like Library of Alexandria can be detrimental in some matchups because you simply don't have time to just take off using a mana every single turn to not cast things.
Boo.
I'm not saying all the time.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of the big note I made about Library versus Bazaar. And like it being colorless mana can cost you, but you do have to sometimes just use the library to cast spells. It is true you won't always get to use it. More often than you did 5 years ago, and definitely more often than you did 10 years ago. Yeah, and there's just kind of more and more really powerful, cheap cards that makes this more true. I mean, it was always a problem if your opponent had a bunch of mana ramp and was casting 2s and 3s off of Moxen or whatever. But Rogavan Nimble Pilferer is a good example of a card that makes it hard to sit around and do nothing. It gets a little bit harder all the time.
And there's a lot more cards like that than there used to be. And the thing is, even though I feel that way about Library, and I think that it can be potentially dangerous because the allure of drawing an extra card can be incredibly great, Bazaar doesn't give you that option. You can't even decide to use it for mana. You don't have that. So once you put it into play, you said, I'm going to be down a land for the rest of the game until my opponent misses a land drop. But then you're still going to be down a land because you know what you've been discarding? Because you discard 3 cards. 3 cards. You're discarding lands, of course. You're not discarding your spells and keeping your lands so you can hit your land drop. If that's the case, don't put Bazaar in your deck. Just hit your land drops like normal. Just put your 17 lands in your deck and go about your day.
Mm-hmm.
Egregious.
Yeah, the argument of using this to smooth a draw in an otherwise ABC normal Magic deck is like, it falls apart pretty quickly.
Oh my God. Anyway, number 5 on our most overrated cards in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, Fastbond. Ryan, why is Fastbond overrated?
So Fastbond is actually an incredibly powerful constructed card and situationally very powerful in Vintage Cube. 1 green mana enchantment. You can pay 1 life to make additional land drops, 1 life per land drop. And there's a lot of really good interactions with this card. The big ones are going to be Courser Crucifix, so you can just keep playing those lands off the top. You can even get really filthy with like Raminap, Excavator, and Strip Mine. And then the draw 7 cards, pairing this with Time Twister or Wheel of Fortune is a sweet spot. What happens more often is somebody first picks Fastbond and plays like Fastbond, pay an extra life for 1 life, pay an extra land for 1 life, go, and just like eventually gets to a point, maybe even the next turn, where they don't have any extra lands to play and they've mulliganed because they control Fastbond. Like the floor is you've just mulliganed with this card. And if you have a couple different ways where you can really go off, and I think it does have to be a full-on combo deck. I think it's very unrealistic to just put this in a fair deck, because what's your plan then? It's like, oh, well, my opening hand had 4 lands. And it's like, okay, so you get to cast 1 or 2 spells ahead of time, where the cube, as we have been talking about, has a lot of really good interaction, much of it in the form of proactive threats. You just have all these creatures that can Ravenous Chupacabra you down, Palace Jailer, this, that, and the other thing. So you have to get some really good use out of those lands, and that usually does mean a full-on combo setup. And you can kind of put that in a fair deck, but it does also mean that in the games where you don't pull off the combo, you are just mulliganing, which your fair deck can't really necessarily afford to do. And I just can't even tell you how often I play that exact game, where like my opponent plays the turn 1 Fastbond. It's like, okay, one of us is dead. How many lands are you going to play? I will know pretty quick. Like if you're not drawing 7 extra cards right now, it's you.
Okay, so I have a note about Bazaar, but I promise I'll rope it back into Fastbond.
Okay.
All right, so you know the other 2 cards we're talking about, Mana Flare, Eureka, Show and Tell, about how those cards inevitably, one way or the other, do create like really, cube moments. Bazaar does not. The moment is like, but I just, they drew a couple of cards, this card at 3, and they did that 4 turns and they lost. That's mainly what happens. Fastball, on the other hand, can create a cube moment. Just like Ryan said, you can play it on the first turn. You dump your whole hand. You go nuts. Who knows what happens? Maybe you don't win on that turn, but you're so far ahead. It's ridiculous. And then, I did all this the first turn. I played 6 lands. So Fastbond is a really, really interesting card because no card really does what it does. There's not another card that allows you to play your lands at that speed that is even remotely cubable.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about something like Mana Bond. Okay, no one's putting that in there. And if they do, if Mana Bond's in a cube, it's probably really, really good because the cube is non-traditional, to say the least. But Fastbond asks maybe more than any other card that we're talking about today for you to entirely shift what you are doing around Fastbond, because there's no like casual incidental Fastbond decks. You can, but then unlike Mana Flare and unlike Eureka and Show and Tell, and unlike even Bazaar of Baghdad, there's a chance that Fastbond actually has no text on it.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes up very frequently. And by very frequently, I mean all of the time it's not in your opening hand. And for those of you doing the math at home, you get 7 cards to look at in your opening hand. And now mulligan rules in recent years have helped Fastbond be less embarrassing than it was in the past, because you get more looks and can keep more cards. Well, you don't keep more cards, but you can get more looks at initial cards to keep. But if Fastbond is not in your opening hand, it actually becomes a dead draw at some point in the game. Now, Fastbond is a combo, another card on this list, Bazaar of Baghdad, because this is a free card to discard because you won't simply need it at that point in the game.
Yeah, that's the other reason that it got more powerful with the new mulligan rules, is you can put it on the bottom and not miss it.
Exactly. Yeah, because you can, either way. The thing is, if you mulligan, first of all, you don't ever want to mulligan in a Fastbond deck. What you want to do is you want to draft Fastbond, hopefully very late. Then you want to draw Fastbond in your first 7-card hand. You don't want to mulligan because you need lands and Fastbond. And another thing, you just need all of the things. Because a thing that I've seen people do too frequently is be like, Fastbond, land, go. And then they don't play a land for the next 2 turns. And then on my 4th turn, they have 1 more land than me. I'm like, all right. That happens a lot.
Yeah,
it's really
sure
difficult
cool for a second.
It looks cool for a second, but it's really difficult to align the stars to make everything come together. Because you need Fastbond, you need the lands, and you need an important thing to do. Like, you actually have to do something. You have to do something with that mana, and you have to do all of this at the same time. It's really difficult.
And Fastbond's a good case study at asking the question why something is powerful. You can't just go to a draft knowing that mana acceleration is powerful. Because if you don't understand why, you're going to end up in those situations like you described, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to put 3 extra lands on the battlefield. If that's what you're doing, Fastbond is dramatically worse than Llanowar Elves. You're not casting other spells, because the Llanowar Elves is a 1/1. Fastbond can't attack, can't block, can't do any of that. If you just make all this extra mana at the cost of extra cards and are not otherwise developing your battlefield, it's not doing anything for you. Fast mana is good because you can spend more mana than your opponent. It's not about generating it necessarily. It's about actually using it. And in particular, the reason that Soul Ring is generally considered the pack one, pick one overall is because you get +2 mana for 1 card. That's good on mana development and incredible on card economy. Whereas Fastbond asks you to subsidize it in other ways on that card economy front because you just run out.
Yeah. And that's it. Then you've just paid unnecessary life and have used a card, spent a deck slot and a slot in your hand on a card that has had no impact on the game. And I don't mean like minimal impact. In a lot of cases, I mean like actual 0 impact on the game.
Yeah. It is by rights a mulligan when it's bad.
It's actually worse than a mulligan. It's worse than a mulligan because you have kept something in the belief that this will make an impact. And then when it doesn't, you've sacrificed like theoretical advantage that you could have had you simply not gone that route at all.
Yeah, it might incentivize you to keep.
Yeah, exactly. And it probably will.
Yeah.
All right. Ryan, any other thoughts on Fastbond or Bazaar? I had a callback, so I figured you'd get one if you want.
Yeah, the only point I want to make about Bazaar, and there is one redeeming quality in the card, and it is the fact that it is from Arabian Nights. Like a paper copy of Bazaar of Baghdad, it's cool as hell.
Very cool. Yeah,
if you want to put that in your cube, that's awesome. Shuffling up a HP Bazaar of Baghdad that's splitting at the seams, I love that shit.
Yeah.
Playing it with different art on Magic Online when it sucks shit in your deck is not the same.
Yeah. I will fully co-sign this statement. When you can look at a card, when I can hold a Bazaar of Baghdad in my hand and know that this is discarded over 1,000 cards in its lifetime, that's a little bit different.
Yeah.
Still not good. But
yeah, it still should go pretty late in the draft, but everybody gets to see it then.
Yeah, exactly. Still not good, but there's something to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not soulless.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. That's 4 down, 4 to go. And if your feathers have not been ruffled yet, then we're going to see what we can do with these next 4. So we're going to take a quick break and come back with number 4 in just one moment.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of the Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
All right, everybody, buckle up. We're halfway through most overrated cards, and I feel like we're in the feather ruffling territory now, because I think that the first set of cards that we talked about, a lot of people know, and they've seen the horrors that come about drafting and attempting to use these cards. We might have some disagreement going forward. So, number 4, their most overrated cards for the Magic Online Vintage Cube Edition. Emrakul, The Promised End. Ryan, why is this card overrated?
So this card does have a kind of recency bias and association for ruining and then being banned from Standard. It was really unreasonable there. 13 mana, 13/13, flying trample. Take control of your opponent's next turn when you cast it. Cost 1 less for each card type in your graveyard. I don't think I've actually ever had a Vintage Cube deck that I wanted to play this card in. And I think that this card, it's like really easy to conceive of a cube where this is the best card. And in fact, I maintain several cubes where if I just put it in, it would be the best card. Because you play kind of a delirium game. I like that mechanic. If you're casting this card for 6 or 7, it's bonkers. Especially if you're just playing kind of cube where you just make those many land drops, naturally good card types in the graveyard, whatever. In most of my vintage cube decks, I have like 3 total card types represented, maybe 4.
Yeah.
So I just can't cast this card ever. Like it's at the point in the mana curve where I could be casting Craterhoof Behemoth or Gristlebrand and winning on the spot, as opposed to kind of rolling the dice. And then I see it more often in decks trying to cheat it into play, be that with Sneak Attack or Reanimator. Oh. With Sneak Attack, it's like you need a full nother thing. So it's like a point in your combo where you've fully gone off. You have the way to cheat a thing and a thing, but then you just need a full other thing. Where there's a bunch of different versions of the Emrakul side of that thing that will just win the game or otherwise significantly hinder your opponent, not just hit them for 13. Like if you put an Ashen Rider, for example, and just Stone Rain them twice, they'll at least have a tougher go of recovering. It deals less damage, but it's more likely to let you win just easily some other way. And if you're reanimating it, like it's big. I mean, I'd put it in some of my Reanimator decks, I guess, but it's not Gristlebrand. It's not Archon of Cruelty. All it is big. Yeah. And protection from instance is good, but we've mentioned a number of times, just there's a ton of creatures that just blank this thing. Your Ravenous Chupacabra, your Venser Shaper Savant, your Palace Jailer. You can all just clean up the Emrakul easily. And I don't know. Even in the games when it's good, just any other large creature would do the same thing. I just so rarely see this card wheel, and I feel like it just kind of always should.
Yeah, I think it's defensible in Reanimator decks, contingent on where the person drafted it.
Sure.
So
you do want a volume of threats to reanimate.
Yeah. I mean, I'll play Emrakul the Promised End in my Reanimator deck basically 100% of the time if I'm drafting it in the second half of the draft. If I didn't have to spend like a premium pick on it, it's probably going to make my deck.
Mm-hmm.
But it's, like Ryan said, and I think this is also my experience, that this is just a highly drafted card across cubes, just in general, and especially the Vintage Cube. And the problematic thing is and this is the case with a lot of these cards, people really just envision a magical Christmas land scenario. It is really easy to look at this card and say, oh yeah, it says 13 on here, but what it really means is I can reduce this for 8 because that's how many card types there are in Magic and just cast this for 5 mana. Well, let's say you're only half right, which is the realistic scenario. Let's say you have land, instant sorcery, creature in your graveyard. Okay, you're looking at a 9 mana creature. It doesn't matter that it's a 13/13. Ignore that part. Are you interested in having a 9 mana spell in your deck? Because I would say in most cases that is no. I would say in almost all cases, people don't put 9 mana spells into their deck unless they're doing some sort of other shenanigan type things. But that probably resolves around 2 other cards that we talked about. You know, maybe you're talking about Mana Flare or Eureka or Show and Tell, and we already talked to you about how we feel about those. So this is just a payoff for a card we already don't think is good.
Yep.
I don't think that this is a bad card. Actually, of all of the cards that we have talked about, this is easily the most playable card. However, its colorlessness also tricks people into believing this is a card that goes into every deck, and that's not even remotely close to being the case. I think that there are decks that you are able to play this successfully and reduce it by a pretty decent amount. And maybe if this becomes a 7-drop, then you can more realistically consider this an active part of your game plan. But there's so few decks where that's the case. And a lot of people, especially I see most frequently is people draft this for like a finisher and control decks. And I don't really understand that. Like, I don't understand the thought process behind I'm going to put all of these cards into my graveyard at a high rate enough to reduce this to where I can like actually cast it at any point in the game.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're reducing it by 4 and getting to 9 mana and you're like, I'm going to cast this and win. Well, it sounds like you could have cast anything to win. It sounds like it didn't have to be Emrakul. It could have just been anything.
Yeah, that's kind of the hallmark.
If you're to the point, where you have controlled the game to the very end of the game and then you cast your single threat, it could have been anything. Who cares?
Yeah, that's like the hallmark of the dead average control player. It's like, well, I need a card to win the game. It's like, just animate Mishra's Factory. You don't need like a full ass card. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Have some self-respect.
You need any card. Look, I can promise you, I can assure you that the card Snapcaster Mage has dealt more damage in control decks in Cube than Emrakul the Promised End has.
Oh, yeah.
And it's probably not even close. And probably ended the game more times. And I don't mean end the game by its ability. I mean by attacking for 2 than Emrakul has. And again, it's not that this card is bad. It's just that people think because it's colorless and because it tells you that you can reduce the cost of it, this can just go in every deck. And it can't. Unlike all of the other cards on this list, people don't assume those cards can go in every deck. They all think that these are, this is this really specific deck, but I have the tools to craft it and I'm going to make it work. This is the opposite problem. People think Emrakul goes everywhere. And in fact, it goes a small amount of places. It can be powerful in those, and I actually don't disagree that this is a powerful card. I have this card in my cube, but I also support like multiple graveyard strategies. But I still see this get drafted by decks that's not really intended for. I actually wish that I could put like mana pips on this card to help people. Not because it would make the card better in context, even though it would make the card worse overall. It'd make it better in context because it would at least tell people where this is supposed to go. It wouldn't be. It would not be a blue and a white mana pip, by the way, which is what most people think.
Yeah.
All right. Any other thoughts on Emrakul before I move on to number 3?
That's kind of what I got on that Emrakul. I feel like if for the type of decks that I like to draft and type of decks I think are good, people generally draft the other Eldrazi too highly. However, there's some very obvious success cases. And if you are just shooting them in once, like Sneak Attack in the ones with the Annihilator, again, just like I said with Ashen Rider, if you can wipe out your opponent's battlefield, really stunt their development, I'm about it. Just a 13 ball, I don't think that's good enough.
Yeah. I think it can be, but I think you have to be in a pod where other people believe what we believe, and you get it in the back half of the draft.
Yeah, that's going to be clutch.
Yeah, and that's, in my experience, that's just not the case.
Right.
People really love this card. I like this card a lot. I will be honest, but I also don't draft it. I don't draft it highly.
Mm-hmm.
There's very few scenarios where I'm drafting this in a pack in like my first, 8 to 10 picks. And I think I don't think it comes outside of that very often.
Yeah, that'd probably be the range where I would take it as well. And
yeah.
it would be like the last card in my Reanimator deck most often.
Yeah. All right. Time to move on to number 3. I think this is the one that people are going to be most upset about.
Oh yeah, people are not going to like this.
No, they're not going to like it. Number 3 on our most overrated cards, Magic Online Vintage Cube Edition. Hymn to Tourach. Ryan, why is this card overrated?
There's a really good chance that I am Hymn to Tourach's biggest detractor, like in the whole world. Card has a couple issues. The big one, the one that you and I are really going to agree on, black, double pip.
Hate those pips.
Not about it. And I was talking about Reanimator earlier in the context of Bazaar of Baghdad and how much more powerful and consistent Reanimator decks are when you just put blue cards in them. That's also true of every archetype in Vintage Cube, certainly every black one. So I think that black is a pretty serious ask. And then it's also the case, specifically in Vintage Cube, there's going to be different cubes that have different reasons why Hymn to Tourach would underperform in them. It's good in some cubes, but Vintage Cube has a problem where your opponent doesn't need that many cards to close the game. We're talking about the most powerful cards in Magic. It's really difficult to completely just obliterate their chance of winning with a random discard effect. Like, it both has to be true that 1 or 2 cards in their hand fully make up their strategy, and then you have to hit those cards. And your odds on one of those things independently, of those 2 things you need to have happen, they're both kind of low. And to the extent that it is true, you'll get a lot more mileage about Thoughtseize. I think that Thoughtseize is actually considerably more powerful than Hymn to Tourach. And it's also true that Thoughtseize is more appropriate for more Magic environments because random discard very bad play patterns. Because it is 2 cards in formats that are less powerful, a lot easier to clean up a game with Hymn to Tourach. So Thoughtseize is going to be worse in those environments. But when it comes to the most powerful Magic formats, constructed or limited, the surgical nature of being able to choose with Thoughtseize is generally going to be much more impactful.
I'll go a step further. I think the following cards are more powerful than Hymn to Tourach.
Ooh.
Okay. Thoughtseize, absolutely, no question, easily. I think Inquisition of Kozilek is more powerful. I think the card Duress is more powerful. It is very difficult to find a 2-mana discard spell that I think is cube playable. The only one that I can think of off the top of my head, and obviously this is quite more of a card than him, in my opinion, is Collective Brutality, but that's also because it does like 4 things.
Yeah, and I don't think that comparisons. I would take Collective Brutality over Hymn to Tourach every time.
Yes, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually think that it's significantly better. And that's the only I can't even think of another 2-mana discard spell that I think is good. And that's like the only one. And I think all the rest of them are 1 mana.
I play Kitesail Freebooter sometimes, and I also think that that's better than Hymn to Tourach. Yeah, part of that is that you're trying to facilitate Fallen Shinobi in Vintage Cube. You're trying to facilitate those really big plays, and Hymn to Tourach just does less for you. You know, both having the Freebooter be more surgical, being targeted in the discard, and then setting you up to take advantage of some stuff that cares about having a battlefield position.
Look, I will admit, one of the best feelings in Magic, and I've cast him Tourach. I promise you, listeners, probably more than most of you that are listening right now. Now, most of this is mostly in 4-of formats, but there's not a lot of greater feelings than casting him to Tourach on turn 2 when you're on the play and hitting 2 of your opponent's lands. That's awesome. It's awesome as a player. It's terrible as a cube designer. But we're not talking about design today. We're talking about it as a player if you're drafting. That's great. That happens a very, 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 very small amount of the time. In most cases, you're gonna cast him to Tourach on a turn that's not the second turn. And then you're also not gonna be able to cast another spell. Because you have to, one, be really base black for this card to work. This is not an easily splashable card. Ryan already brought up the pips. You all know how we feel about those. And 2, because this is 2 mana, it makes it difficult in a lot of scenarios to play this at a meaningful point in the game and also play something else. The times when you can play this and play something else is later in the game when this card is not good because you're not necessarily... Look, if you're getting the last 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, that's great. You could have also cast Wrench Mind or Mind Rot and it would have had the same effect. In the early portion of the game, 2 mana is so difficult regardless of the fact that it could potentially get 2 cards, of the tempo loss that you are using because you have to put 2 of your black mana into casting this card. And if you're base black, you have to, unless you're entirely mono black and you just have all swamps, if you're base black, it's going to be difficult for you to cast another black card at the same time in even a 2-color deck. Mm-hmm. Anything outside of a 2-color deck, you just take that off the table. Because you can't consider yourself being able to cast that until later in the game. And at that point, that's when discard spells are generally bad. The lack of targeted things, in my opinion, in Cube is just, like I said, I think even something like a Duress is significantly more powerful than him to Tourach. Even though the ceiling is incredibly high, the floor for this card is very low, but it's really hard to see because you're not looking at the effect it's going to have on your play patterns and your deck makeup for you being able to cast this card on time when it's relevant. And it just has a huge, huge impact that's really difficult to see because you're always just like, well, I'll cast it next turn, I'll cast it next turn, I'll cast it next turn. Oh, it wasn't good. Well, that wasn't him's fault. It was because they had all this other stuff going on. They only had 1 card left in their hand. Well, but it was because of the scenario that card costing black put you in. And we talk about pips a lot on this show, and there's a reason for that. It's incredibly difficult to put those cards in your deck and cast them in a meaningful way, especially when they have 0 impact on the board.
Yep. Yeah, and the more powerful the environment, the more pressure there is to really get on the battlefield. And I agree with all those cards that you named. I don't take him over any of them. In fact, I rarely take him. And the stuff about the random discard and it being worse late in the game, it bears mentioning because some people might be thinking about the card. I do take Mind Twist incredibly highly because you cast that and you just make X all the cards in their hand. Like I don't take Mind Twist so that I can cast it for X equals 2. That's never in the plan. Like if they only have 2 cards in their hand, sure.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah. And I also feel very differently about Mind Twist. I love Mind Twist, but that's because Mind Twist is incredibly flexible in the opposite way that him is, which is not flexible at all.
Right. Yeah. Splashable can take every card. So you eliminate that randomness.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I love him. The last time I put it into a cube was the SCG Con Cube 2 years ago. And that was not because I believed it was good. It's because I was trying to create... I had a lot of other things that I was trying to do with that cube that wasn't just about playing Magic.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's the kind of thing that people look for this and other cards in Vintage Cube because it's one of the few places that you can play it.
That's
I do
exactly
have
right.
him to Tourach and the Grixis tuber. Some of that is that the mana is much easier.
Well, that's what I was going to say, Ron. You took away two of the other colors.
Yeah, that black requirement much easier, and that's a big deal.
Yeah. In a mono black cube, I would say this card is a lot better.
Oh, yeah.
When you're just playing all swamps.
This is a very high pick in a mono black cube.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, look, I personally, outside of cube, I love him, but I have not cubed with this card in one of my personal cubes in a very long time, and it's been even longer since I've actually drafted it and casted it. It's kind of the sad state of how this card plays out, and I think it's aged. Of all of the cards that we've talked about, this card might have aged the poorest of just about anything.
I think that the next card we talk about is going to be the absolute poorest that any card is aged, but this is got to be number 2.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the next card, I know you want it right now, but we're going to give you one more ad because we don't have a choice, quite frankly. So we're going to take one more ad break, and when we come back, our top 2 cards are overrated. Hey, let me ask you something. Do you like value? Look, no need to answer that. 1, I can't hear you. 2, I already know that you do, okay? You're a Magic player. 1. 2, you love Cube. That's why you're listening to this podcast. Well, the only thing that's better than listening to this podcast for free is becoming a Star City Games premium member. For $7.99 a month, you get exclusive access to Magic the Gathering content from some of the best writers and creators in the entire game. And on top of that, you get 5% off of all Magic sealed product, 10% off of all Magic singles, and 15% off of all supplies. And yes, that includes sleeves, deck boxes, the works. If you love value, and I know you do, go to starcitygames.com/join-premium. Star City Games Premium, $7.99 a month. Get that value right now. All right, time to continue to ruffle the feathers, Ryan, as we have our number 2 card and our most overrated cards for the Magic Online Vintage Cube. Number 2 is Balance. Ryan, why is Balance so overrated?
It's a card that's really not appropriate for any format in Magic. And when it comes to cubes less powerful than Vintage Cube, it's because it really does become too good, or at least too impactful, too big of a return for what you pay. But then when it comes to Vintage Cube, and there's this weird space where all these other historically incredibly broken cards enter, and then it's no longer really that good at all because it doesn't really compete in the way that you want to in this environment. So what Balance does for 1 and a white, you check the number of cards in hands, lands each player controls, creatures each player controls, and you reduce all of them to the lowest amount. So you discard down to the lowest hand size, sacrifice creatures to the lowest number of creatures, sacrifice lands the same way. And you know what? You know what are 3 really powerful things to have in a game of Magic, Justin?
All of those resources.
Yeah, cards in hand, creatures, and lands on the battlefield. So trying to maneuver yourself into a position where you have less of these things and then to get your opponent even and then pull ahead later is putting yourself in such a weird position to have this set up in that way. And you can definitely swing games in a big way with Balance. The most significant way tends to be when there's not much doing on the battlefield and it's just kind of a mind twist. But you know what card's better at that than Balance? Mind Twist.
Mind Twist.
Yeah. And you can play a bunch of artifact mana, and that's great, but artifact mana into Balance puts you in a position where you can reduce your opponent's resources, but you're not doing anything proactive. You're not actually closing the game. And Planeswalkers did push back against Balance in a big way, right? If you have a Planeswalker in the battlefield, you don't check those. Those just get to stick around. So that's a big problem for Balance. And kind of the other thing about Balance is it can be really difficult to just have your deck just not care about any of these things.
Yeah.
At least in some of the games. Balance was actually in Ryan Sachs's Classic Cube when that was on Magic Online. I saw it early in a number of drafts, never drafted it, and I think it might have wheeled every time. a big element of that cube was like, there was a lot of creature combos, and generally decks were creature focused. It's like, why would you play balance? Like, I'm trying to control the things that are good to control, and balance is telling me not to.
Yeah,
And it just kind of pushes you in these really weird directions. And when it comes to these cards that are historically just totally busted, balance is just, in my opinion, by far the worst one. I will go out of my way not to draft it.
So I think that, we're talking about cards that are poor for the Magic Online Vintage Cube. And I actually think that there is not a card that fares worse in the way that these cubes are run than balance, because in most cases, the drafts are done in a kind of like the league setting, right?
Yep.
That means that you are drafting with a pod, then you're playing against people most often not in your pod. A lot of times you are trying to construct your balance deck because you know what cards you have that you're able to benefit to break the parity of balance. Maybe you have some Moxen, maybe just mana rocks in general, maybe some planeswalkers, and you have those cards and your opponents don't. Well, in the Magic Online, that's not the case at all. You're not able to determine the cards your opponents are not going to have based on what you have drafted in your deck. And this, might be a surprise to everybody. So sit down before I say this. A lot of those mana rock cards, like Moxen, are quite powerful and see a pretty high rate of play when people draft them. I would say pretty close to 100%.
Yeah, about that.
Yeah. So it makes it incredibly difficult in the way that you actually want to imbalance balance for you to achieve that game plan. With the proliferation of planeswalkers, it takes it to another level, because if you are planning to play balance and you don't have a very serious parity breaker, like having a planeswalker or a significant amount of artifact mana, and your opponent is even hedging a little bit in that direction, it makes it, again, a card that you are actually losing resources to cast. And you might actually be forced in a situation to cast it because you're like, well, this is my sweeper. I have to discard 2 cards and sacrifice a land to cast this, but I get to kill 2 of my opponent's creatures and leave their planeswalker. It's going to be a terrible, terrible situation. You 4-for-1 yourself in most cases.
I think it was actually really good to highlight that one of the things you might try to do to take advantage of balance is to yourself control some planeswalkers. You know what you might be able to do to win that game without casting balance?
Probably just have those planeswalkers.
Yeah, continue activating your planeswalkers. It sounds like they're not being attacked, so you're probably fine.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like the scenarios that balance is like, and I don't even like, there's scenarios where it can be busted, but it's like a stars aligning moment.
Mm-hmm.
In most cases, you are just paying for a cheap sweeper at the cost of cards and other cards in your hand, which again are generally very valuable, or lands, which are also valuable, especially because you had to cast a 2-mana sweeper against an aggro deck, so you probably needed those lands to actually win the game. This card, it is incredibly rare that you are not going to lose more than your opponent, or that you're even going to lose the same amount as your opponent. But if that is the case, why are you playing the card?
Yeah.
And this is an incredibly difficult card to assess in the draft because it is all situational in the game. 100% situational in the game. Balance is one of the rare cards on this list that is entirely dependent on what your opponent is doing. And is somewhat dependent on what you're doing, but it's entirely dependent on what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like the ideal case for balance is that you're behind in some way. In general, when you're building your deck, like you should be planning to be ahead. Like the best interaction with balance is mulliganing a lot. Like, is that your plan? Like, it's really good when you get to mulligan a bunch and then like mox balance, but like your deck's just not going to do that very often.
Maybe, I don't know. Probably. I mean, look, maybe you drafted Bazaar and you got to just pitch all those cards out of your hand and then mind twist your opponent. Now, it would have been better to just draft lands and, put basic lands into play and cast mind twist and do those things. But I'm not here to tell you how to have fun. I'm just telling you whether it's good to have fun in that way or not.
Yeah, specifically Bazaar, not too into it, but I will say that a good balanced deck, I think it's going to be pretty important to have some ways to discard it if you draw it. Like I'm definitely looking to have Jace Vryn's Prodigy if balances in my deck. Just make sure that it's just not your only plan, because again, like you're planning to be behind and then it doesn't actually close the game. So it is a very powerful card, certainly from like the pool of every Magic card ever printed. Plenty of games and environments that it's completely not okay for. Just so happens that in Vintage Cube, it's not the cream of the crop.
Yeah, and really, like, man, I have seen someone playing Vintage Cube and then be like, all right, well, I have 2 Mox in this balance deck, and then their opponent also has 2 Mox, and they're like, oh, well, this card doesn't do anything. And I'm not saying that you're going to have 2 Mox and they're going to have 2 Mox a lot, but there are not many cards that are hurt by the fact that you're not playing in the same pod more than balance in this situation.
Yeah, I buy that.
All right. We say the best for last. Man, I feel strongly about this one. The number 1 most overrated card in Magic Online Vintage Cube is a gem of Magic players everywhere, a pillar of a format, and that, of course, is Brainstorm. Ryan, why is Brainstorm so devastatingly overrated?
So this card is a constructed powerhouse, restricted in Vintage, best card in Legacy, recently restricted and then banned in Historic, for whatever that's worth to anybody. When it comes to playing the card in Constructed, though, the reason it's so powerful is that there's so many ways to reset your deck. You get to play fetch lands in Vintage, or just cast Brainstorm and then cast a tutor immediately. So you get rid of the 2 cards that you put back. So you get all these extra looks, and it actually just kind of makes it so that it's such a good top deck in Legacy when you have a hand where either you're main decking some situational cards, they can be removal spells, they could be force of wills in a game that you kind of have under control, so you're no longer looking to 2-for-1 yourself in that way. They can be extra lands. They can be wastelands against an opponent that's on all basics. Just really anything. If you got some extra cards, you create a sort of virtual card advantage there, where you just replace them with different cards and shuffle them away. And you just really highly increase the quality of your hand. And that's just much more difficult to engineer in Cube, primarily because everybody picks Brainstorm just incredibly highly, and everybody also picks fetch lands incredibly highly. So it's really tough to get both of those things and then also get actual first pick quality power cards, ways to actually think cards to build your deck around, proactive ways to actually get into games. It's just so hard to make the stars align for Brainstorm. And people like to point out that it's like, it's not bad to cast Brainstorm. It's like, well, when we're talking about the most powerful cards in Magic, like the case where you don't reset with the Brainstorm, like, yeah, like you get a card deeper or whatever. Like, it's not that big of a deal if you get locked because it's even on cards or whatever. It's like, okay, but there's no other card in the cube you would put in your deck to do that. Like, we're talking about the most powerful cards in the history of the game. We're talking about people playing Black Lotuses and Ancestral Recalls. You're not willing to spend a mana to draw 1 card. That is like so far from a realistic consideration. Like that effect's just not remotely worth that. There are some decks that is really good to have Brainstorm in, but it's not just like my deck is playing Magic, therefore Brainstorm is good like it is in Legacy. I'm looking for it for like a deck that's trying to entomb Gristlebrand. So it's like it's actively bad to draw my Gristlebrand. So it's nice to have that reset. Or just decks that do get a number of shuffle effects. Clearly it's good there. Maybe some decks that queue off of casting instants and sorceries. Even there, though, on average, you just get more looks with Ponder unassisted. You get more looks with Preordain unassisted. I don't consider Brainstorm to be in the category of these cards until you already have those reasons why you either have some card in your deck that you want to keep in your deck, or you have ways to reset when you Brainstorm. Because like it's just not doing what any of your other cards are doing. It's not worth any other slot in your deck until you're turning it on.
You know, I think Brainstorm is easily the best card in all of the cards we've talked about today. But it's not about what card is the best and what card is the worst. It's about what's the most overrated. And I see people draft Brainstorm incredibly highly, like in the first couple of picks, and even like in the first couple of picks in a pack, and say, well, I'm just going to draft fetch lands. Yeah, no shit. You're playing Cube. Of course you're going to try to draft fetch lands. Everyone else is too. And there's not that many of them. If you're able to draft Brainstorm, I want to get the best case scenario out of the way first, because this is going to be what people are going to bring up. Mm-hmm. If you've drafted Brainstorm and you have 4 or 5 fetches in your deck, Brainstorm's probably fucking off the rails. Because if you can actually do that in a cube, and Brainstorm looks a lot like Ancestral Recall when you get to put 2 cards back and shuffle them away. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it so powerful in Legacy. That's what makes it restricted in Vintage. That's what makes it powerful in formats where you're able to do that on a regular basis. However, if you have 4 or 5 fetch lands in your deck along with your Brainstorm, you have a very high percentage of the entirety of the fetch lands in the entire cube. Congratulations. Your deck was probably pretty good without Brainstorm.
Yep.
Not saying that you shouldn't have drafted it, but in most cases, people are spending these very, very high picks on Brainstorm to try to chase that scenario. The thing is, I'm always trying to chase that scenario. I want to have 3 or 4 or 5 fetch lands in my deck in most cases, because the utility on those cards is through the roof. I would say the least overrated cards in the entirety of all cubes is fetch lands. So you're taking the cards that are the most desirable by all players across every single cube that they're in, and then you're pairing them with a card that works incredibly well when you have them and works barely when you don't. It was not many weeks ago I was talking about Whispers of the Muse, right?
Yes.
Okay. I don't want to have to bring up Whispers of the Muse. I don't want to have to invoke that when talking about Brainstorm. But a Brainstorm, when you just put 2 back and then you go about your draw step for the next 2 turn and look at those 2 cards again and add them to your hand, you just cast Whispers of the Muse and then you had to think about it for 2 more turns. That's even worse.
Yeah.
Anyway, the fact that this card goes so highly is so frustrating is because it actually does have utility when you don't have to draft it high. I would love to draft Brainstorm in a deck where I can draft it after I've picked my first 8 picks, or even a little bit sooner than that, depending on like the context of my deck so far. It's great in Spellslinger decks. We've talked about that. It's still a blue cantrip. But the fact that people are putting this on a pedestal, not just in the context of blue cantrips, but across all of the cards in Cube, is completely asinine.
Mm-hmm.
This is a card in a format where most of the best cards accelerate mana, especially in Vintage Cube, or like change the landscape of the game. And those are the cards you generally need to be picking to have a successful deck in Vintage Cube. Highly. Not in general. You know, you obviously need to fill your deck out with roughly 23 cards, but those are the cards you're going to be spending your first several picks on each pack. Brainstorm doesn't do that. There could be a scenario at the end of the draft, you open in a pack 3 and you're like, wow, I have so many fetch lands. Yeah, you could sell me on Brainstorm being the best card in that pack. But you know what? I bet it's still not. But that's the scenario where I think it's acceptable to take it. And I think anything before that, the main issue with Brainstorm is you have to sacrifice so much in the draft portion, not even the play portion, that you really are going to miss out. And in most cases, you're actively making your deck worse because you're trying to chase a dream that the other 7 people at the table are already chasing, and they didn't have to spend a pick to do it.
Well, speaking of chasing a dream, something I will say about you and I advocating for Brainstorm being overrated is we are fighting a battle we know we can't win, right? We've both been around. Matter. You're a big Legacy player. I used to be a big Legacy player. Part of the reason that Brainstorm is overrated is that people cast it when it's actively bad. Like there's just something that doesn't register, and it's really difficult for a lot of players to pick up on. And many articles have been written about this. Many very good players have tried to get the point across. Like, listen, you can't just cast Brainstorm on turn 1. You know, like you can keep a 1 land hand with a Ponder if it really gets going. If you hit a land, because you get a lot of looks. You really shouldn't do that with Brainstorm, right? Brainstorm, it's so unlikely that Brainstorm is the difference between making a hand keepable or unkeepable. like, as compared to any other cantrip, because the other cantrips just give you so much more smoothing. And the one hand that does get really good if you have Brainstorm over a Ponder is a hand. Maybe it's got too many lands, but it does have a fetch land. So the Brainstorm can really clean that up. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting there. But even then, you wouldn't keep a 5-lander. And 4 lands isn't, you're not really flooded yet when you have 4 lands. So it's not really doing that much there anyway. The thing is, just casting Brainstorm with no intention of resetting when you still have cards in your hand, it's just always better to wait to play it until you know you're coming up on a decisive turn of the game. You need a very specific thing. You need to get going now. The wisdom around Brainstorm, you want to cast it at the latest point possible, see the most cards, or be in one of those situations where you can reset, really sculpt your hand. But just everybody casts it at inopportune times all the time. Even I, knowing when you're supposed to do it, I still just sometimes cast it and go, shit, I really should have waited a turn there. And like that really costs you. And that is, it doesn't seem like it should, because, it's just replacing itself. But it's like, well, what other card would I put it in? It's not like it's just over a land or a Whispers of the Muse, like you said. Like, I'm probably putting Brainstorm in my deck over a business card, like over some card that would impact the battlefield. When it comes to higher picks, I'm looking for those over Brainstorm.
So I'd like to provide a little bit of context and maybe a little bit of, back in my day story for Brainstorm. So I've been playing Magic for a really long time, right? 22 years.
Mm-hmm.
And Brainstorm, for those of you that can believe this, there was a time that Brainstorm existed when fetch lands did not. And in Standard, back when I was in the early days of me playing Magic, there was this time in Standard where Brainstorm, and it's actually the last time it's been printed in the Standard, by the way, but Brainstorm was in Standard at the same time that the card Opt was in Standard. Okay, Brainstorm and Marcadian Mask Opt came out a year later, Invasion. Ryan, would you like to take a guess of until Onslaught came out, and this is when Brainstorm and Marcadian Mask were no longer in Standard? How many people were playing Brainstorm in their decks during that time in any format?
Pre-fetch lands?
Pre-fetch lands.
It'd be a hard sell to get me to play that one pre-fetch lands.
Well, no one did. It was not a hard sell for anybody because they just didn't do it. But when Opt came out, people lost their minds. Okay, now we've come a long way since Opt. And now that Opt has become back a staple in Standard, people realize that card is really not so bad. We just have had better options.
Mm-hmm.
But let me tell you, I want people to envision a scenario where you have a format where you have Brainstorm and Opt, and people are choosing to play Opt over Brainstorm 100 times out of 100. It's because fetch lands and the concept of that did not exist yet. In most cube games, you are actually faced with that same scenario, and most people are choosing Brainstorm over Opt. And it's not correct. You have to have that additional utility. It doesn't always have to be fetch lands. There needs to be something, and you have to have it in high degrees. And most of the time, you just don't.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, you can't sacrifice an early pick on a card that 20 years ago people just didn't want to play because Opt came out. Okay, and that's the card you're choosing to play. You're not choosing to play Legacy Brainstorm. Okay, you're not choosing to play Vintage Brainstorm. You're choosing to play Marcadian Mask, no fetch lands Brainstorm. Don't do it.
That's generally really good context. My only qualm, I really like Opt, so less resonant with me. Too. But your point does stand.
Yeah. All right, that was it. That's our list. Ryan, do you have any thoughts on Brainstorm or any other card on our top 8 overrated cards for the Magic Online Vintage Cube?
Well, if people, I don't think there's anything I can really say to convince the Brainstorm crowd, but I did remember a really funny show and tell story from the weekend.
Love it.
So I played against one of the most bizarre Vintage Cube decks I've ever played against in my life. I was playing, I believe it was a Reanimator deck. I know I had Grave Titan in my deck. It was like a Reanimator deck that was kind of mid-range. And in game 1, my opponent played Bitter Blossom into Tanglewire into Smokestack. And I was like, all right, that's pretty good. Good for you. You got me. Like, kind of hard to fight back. They might have stripped behind me too. And in game 2, they just like cast Show and Tell, which think about the cards that I said they cast in game 1, right? So like Bitter Blossom, whatever. It's like weird to juxtapose with Show and Tell, but then you have just 2 major mana denial cards in Smokestack and Tanglewire. But then you just like cast Show and Tell. It's like, all right, well, you can have 1 on the house. So that was really weird. But then it got weirder when I put in Grave Titan, and they also put in Grave Titan.
And well.
Then I killed their Grave Titan and won very easily. And then in game 3, they had a setup where, like, I think I thought seized them and left them with the Show and Tell, and they had kind of nothing doing. And they like Vampiric tutored, and they cast the Show and Tell, and I had the Grave Titan again. I was like, well, I hope that they Vampiric tutored for something better than Grave Titan. And they did. They put in Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, but then I ripped Ravenous Chupacabra and just killed it. Yeah. And it was one of the funniest matches against a Show and Tell deck I've ever had.
Sounds like deserving all around in that.
Both
scenario.
Teams tried hard. Yeah,
they did. Yeah. Yeah, that's the old Grave Titan is the, I would love to see someone make a meme of Show and Tell as the background, and then it's 2 Spider-Mans pointing at each other, but it's Grave Titans pointing at each other.
That'd be a good one.
That's good. Well, that's our top 8 overrated cards for Vintage Cube. If you would love to hear us do another top 8 of overrated cards for something else, I don't even know what. And I know this is just one that, Ryan and I love to just, riff on stuff, especially things that we don't like, mainly things that we don't like. So
I'd be interested in a top 8 things that we like. Let's not take it off the table.
No, I don't want to take it off the table. That's true. Yeah. If you have a singular topic of things that we either do like or don't like, let us know. In addition to letting us know on that, you can, of course, let us know what you'd like us to talk about for our mailbag episode, which is coming next week. You have until October 31st to get at us, likely either on Twitter or in the comments of YouTube, which are the 2 primary places we're able to easily get it. But like I said at the top of the show, you can take your chance if you want to put it elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
No guarantees. If you want to subscribe to the 540, you can do so on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, your local podcast app, anywhere you can listen to podcasts, wherever you're listening to this right now. Leave us a review if you're able, whether it's a text review, whether it's 5 stars, whether you just want to give us a thumbs up. If you're able to do that, sure, that'd be great. Involve yourself with the algorithm. It loves it. Anywhere you can do that, we always appreciate it. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter. That's where you can get at me about this mailbag. You can do it at Ryan, too. He'll tell you where he can find you in a second. You can find my other podcast, Think Twice MTG, anywhere you can find this one, as well as Commander Versus on Star City Games and YouTube every single week. Ryan, what about you?
You can find me on Twitter at Ryan Overdrive, and you can find my articles weekly on StarCityGames.com. Last week, I did write about the updates to the Vintage Cube, which is still live for a couple of weeks, so you can go back and check out that article to keep you abreast of all the new cards being added or reintroduced to the cube. And then I actually know my article for this week. I don't always, because we're kind of a weird schedule with recording, writing, publishing, and, kind of know that Vintage Cube's just staying up, which meant that this week I could write about whatever I want. And I just put out, it should already be live on the website, an article about my first stab at modular Tuberts, which is maybe a string of nonsense to most people. You have to read the article to check it out.
I will. As always, I'll have to wait. You, indeed, dear listener, will not have to. You can go find that right now. So we want to thank everybody for listening as usual this week, and remind everyone, mailbag coming next week. Okay, get those questions in now. We got a bunch of good ones. I'm really excited to dig in and answer some of these questions. But thank you all very, very much for listening. We'll catch you at the mailbag coming to you next week.